In honor of Holocaust Remembrance Day, we partner with Jewish Community Center in Harrison, and we are featuring author Ella. Um, Ella, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Sorry.
Scheinwald.
Scheinwald. Should ask earlier. Here's the book. Giovanna has it behind her. You can see it much better. Well, and we have Rabbi Hammerman here who will welcome everyone, and Giovanna Inace, our programming librarian, will introduce our author. So, Rabbi.
Indeed, thank you so much, Galina, and thank you to all. I wish I was welcoming you to our synagogue building or welcoming you to the wonderful Halperin Library building downtown in Harrison. Alas, I'm welcoming you to your own homes, or wherever you may find yourselves this evening, but I'm welcoming you on an auspicious date on the calendar. It's not a coincidence that we planned our evening for tonight, for January 27th, because January 27th, 1945, we had the liberation of Auschwitz. And 76 years later, we saw the word Auschwitz terribly on some guy's sweatshirt breaking into the US Capitol building. You never could have imagined 76 years and one day later that something like this could happen or would happen in 2021. But indeed, we have things like this happening. And that's why we have to keep working for a brighter and more just future, keep teaching our children, keep teaching our grandchildren, keep teaching our great-grandchildren the lessons of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was an event that impacted the Jewish community the most, but not only. And the Holocaust has lessons, even though it impacted the Jewish community the most, absolutely lessons for the entire world. For that period of time, 76 years ago, and even for our day and age this evening. So thank you all for taking this evening and dedicating this evening for being here for such an important author event. And of course, to our friends at the Harrison Public Library, we are so happy always as a synagogue to partner with Galina, to partner with Giovanna, all the other wonderful staff at the library. Our synagogue has had a long relationship with the Harrison Public Library, and we look forward to keeping it going for many, many, many more years to come. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi. And now it's my pleasure to tell you about the authors of Wolf, A Story of Hate, and to introduce Ella Scheinwald to you this evening. Ze'ev Scheinwald was born on July 4th, 1921 as Wolf, meaning Ze'ev in Hebrew, Scheinwald, in Sohachev, Poland. When World War II broke out in 1939, he was taken prisoner and sent to various labor and concentration camps, while his entire family was exterminated by the Nazis and their collaborators. He arrived in Israel in 1946, was enlisted in the military, and later worked in construction, over time becoming a successful building contractor. He then moved with his family to Côte d'Ivoire in Africa, where he headed a major construction company. Later, he moved with his wife and children to Paris. Work brought them to many countries, including Venezuela, where he also led major construction projects. Ze'ev became a successful businessman. He and his wife, Bruria, helped with numerous philanthropic causes. He passed away in 2013. Ella Scheinwald is a well-respected executive and business strategy advisor who specializes in facilitating client problem solving. Ella coaches executives individually and in groups and works with all industries, from multi-billion-dollar global companies to privately owned small enterprises. She also provides personal coaching and consulting services to individuals as well as to public figures. Ella graduated from the Sorbonne University in Paris with a BA and master's degrees and completed another MA and a postgraduate degree at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. One of Ella's latest projects was as internal consultant to the Vatican. Please join me in welcoming Ella Scheinwald. Thank you for being here, Ella.
Thank you, Giovanna. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me today. I actually want to start with something the rabbi mentioned, which is the end, the liberation. And it was not something my father ever felt. He never felt liberated. Officially, the war for him ended on May 5th, 1945. May 5th was also the date that coincided with the publication of my book. But he never felt liberated because he never felt he actually survived the war. So I want to start by saying that because that sense of being a prisoner throughout his life colored his whole life, and of course colored my own. As a second generation, I don't need special days to remember the Holocaust. I live and breathe it every single day. Even when I was little, when we moved to Côte d'Ivoire, I was 5, 6, 7. The bedtime stories I heard were about the Holocaust and about loss. And I would hear my father scream at night, and I did not know what that meant. But I felt even as a child that I had to take on all his pain and somehow save him. Little did I know that would be an impossible task. It took me many, many years to discover that. He was born in Sochachev. Sochachev is a little town about 50 kilometers from Warsaw. And he had parents and uncles and aunts, and there were 7 siblings. He was the second one. His older brother was about 20 when the war broke. My father was 18, and he had 5 additional siblings, ages 16, 12, 10, 8, 5, and so on. And everyone was murdered. The idea for the book started many, many years ago. I was hoping that if he started putting some memories down, that it would alleviate his pain. And so back in the 80s, I sat down with him and started interviewing him for the book. And we started working on it together, with me asking many questions and trying to elicit his memories and try to crystallize some of the confused feelings and thoughts he had at the time. It was a very, very difficult and complex endeavor. And it took us many, many years until we finally had something that sounded like a memoir. However, I did not want this to be another Holocaust-related story because my father spent the war in small labor camps. He did spend some time in Buchenwald, and the last camp he was at was Mauthausen. Both of them are more well-known. But the other camps he was at were small camps that were owned by a company named HASAG, which is spelled H-A-S-A-G, which was a weapon armament manufacturing firm. And they had many, many camps throughout Poland and Germany. And in those camps, they would use slave labor force, Jewish slave labor force, but they were de facto death camps where the business objectives were not as important as the murder, the genocide objective. That was the ideal. And so it became a paradox that these companies who were having these manufacturing labor camps became a part of a killing machine, despite the fact that it sabotaged their own business benefits. So for those who have not read the book, one of the first camp was Skaržisko, the other one was Schlieben, and the third one was Flossbild. And in these camps and other small labor camps, the number of people who were murdered was way higher than in relative numbers than in the large, well-known camps. However, no one knows about them. There has not been really much focus put on these labor camps. So it was important for me to analyze what was happening in that particular context. And I started editing the book. I started writing it. My father and I, we wrote it in Hebrew, and I translated it myself to English. And when the book was almost about to be published, I saw an article in New York Magazine by a journalist you may know named Frank Rich. If you're interested, I think it was in early January 2020, that article. And he talks about some labor camps, particularly companies like, he quotes GM and Ford as maintaining labor camps during the Holocaust, where there was a Jewish slave force that was murdered in camps where they built parts for GM and Ford, which they in turn sold to the Hitler regime. So in fact, these companies were in bed with that regime. And I believe he quotes either both CEOs at the time or one of them. And the CEO said that he's not interested in any philosophies or racist theories or anything. He's just interested in business, and business makes sense, in these particular camps. So my father was taken from his home to Skaržisko. He was 18 years old, and he was put in front of machines to build weapons for the Germans. And that started a long nightmare of everything that you would know that typifies what Holocaust survivors went through. That is torture, starvation, disease, beatings, loneliness, a sense of dread, degradation, dehumanizing, and not knowing what happened to the family, to his little sister, to his parents. He was taken to Skaržisko from the Warsaw Ghetto, where his mother perished, and he never saw his family again. From Skaržisko, he was moved to Schlieben, which was a harsher camp, and from Schlieben to Flossbild, which was such a horrible camp. It is just undescribable and incomprehensible. The hate that they endured, the torture that they endured, is just extremely difficult to relay and for us to understand. Yet we have to talk about it because our children and their children need to know about this, because hate is alive and well, as you know, as we saw recently in this country. Basically, death dominated everything. And that was the purpose. That was the dream for not just the Germans, but everyone who collaborated with them. So I want to say a couple of things about that point, because when I grew up in different countries. I was born in Israel, but I grew up in Africa and in Paris mostly. But even in Israel, there's this notion that Jews went to the gas chambers like cattle, and that they did not fight. And we need to change this narrative because it is not a true narrative. We have to change this collective narrative because the people who followed like cattle were the millions who perpetrated the genocide, who perpetrated mass murder. It was the Germans who supported Hitler. It was the Austrian, the Ukrainians, the Polish people. They dreamt of a Poland free of Jews. This is what they wanted. And they cooperated with the Nazi regime with great enthusiasm. Millions of people followed Hitler like cattle. It was not the Jews who went to the gas chambers. And I think it's an important point that we need to change this narrative so that we understand and so that we also become vigilant as to what happens in the future when we talk about leadership and when we choose leadership, that we understand who leads who and who follows whom. The other point that I want to make is that words have power. Words can change society. And we need to be careful what kind of words we use. All of us now know the power of fake media, of fake news. Still, many people follow that and believe it. And so it becomes like a parallel reality. Whatever is fake becomes real for millions of people. And so I think it's important when we talk about the Holocaust that we don't just come from a sense of what they did to us, that we're victims, but we look at it from a point of strength and from a perspective of learning, so it never happens again. As it was mentioned, when the attack on the Capitol happened earlier this month, there was a guy with an Auschwitz sweatshirt, and there were also people wearing some shirts that said 6 million was not enough. And that was manipulated by those who do not believe that hate happens here, by those who do not believe the Holocaust can happen again. But I can assure you that if we are not vigilant, it can and it will happen again. I wanted to share a couple of passages from the book, if you don't mind. I picked a couple of brief paragraphs just to give you a sense of the mood of the spirit of what we wrote. Sorry, I need my glasses. This is all in labor camps, okay, owned by a Hasag. Once the Germans decided to hold the election, they would bring in a large force of Ukrainian, the Werkschutz, who surrounded the camp, heavily armed with automatic weapons, and killed according to orders issued by the Germans. A small group of armed Germans would then enter the camp. They were ordered to stand to attention in the assembly area. There were 4 assemblies of 3 rows, each row forming a square around Appelplatz. Then the Germans would indicate to the Jewish police how they wanted the selection to be conducted. They would take out a whole row, each 3rd row in 1 row, the middle row, each 2 lines, whatever they felt like on that day. The chosen ones would then march to the left or to the right, surrounded by Germans and Ukrainians, and taken out to camp to Verksy, where the Ukrainians executed them. The reason for the number of armed murderers guarding us during selections was because they were afraid there would be unrest, so they were prepared to assassinate all of us if needed. We would run around like mice before each selection, trying to figure out where to place ourselves so we would not be designated for death that day, as if we could predict how the Germans would do the selection. They were completely arbitrary. Each time, the Germans found new inventive ways to keep things entertaining for them and confusing for us. We tried to guess what type of selection would be made on a particular day and shuffle ourselves accordingly. We missed our families more and more, and we were so starved, we were losing our minds from hunger. We could not think, our bodies could not function, and the accumulated exhaustion of all those years of suffering took over. We collapsed with fatigue and started thinking we could no longer go on. We wanted to die painless death. There was no more strength to feel the hurt. There was no point to such a life, and perhaps to the life that would follow, if after all we endured and managed to survive the war. The chance was very small that we would make it. Had I known what hell found me to end it then. I was psychic and I was too young. I wanted very much to live, so I went on. I was too tired from life. I was 23, how could that be? It came from hunger. I told my friends, those among you who will live, don't forget what happened here. What they did to us. What youthful naivete. I was certain then that someone in this world really cared. There's also a passage, I won't read it to you, where the Germans took a little boy, and made him a capo. And when the war ended, the boy was 13. But in one of the labor camps, they made him hang his own parents. And the boy hang his own parents. And after May 5th, 1945, what the Nazis had taught this boy, he did to them. I want to read one last passage, and maybe then people will have some questions. Once upon a time, there was a town in Poland, and about 5,000 Jews lived there. But they were erased from the face of the earth, and there are no more Jews in Sochachev, only a memorial for those the earth swallowed. After 600 years of life in Poland, there are no more Jews there. And I am merely a murdered person who breathe and can move about. The world seems too small for me. Maybe I would be better off on another planet. After I arrived to Israel, I moved many times. I built 4 houses, but found no place for myself here on this earth. For me, there was no happy ending. When I was a child, I followed the participants in the parade given by the Sochachev firefighters with my friends, stepping with the rhythm of the march music, our eyes filled with joy and pride, and our hearts excited about the future that was awaiting us. But this world is no longer, and really never was. We just did not know it yet. I want to say one more thing. My father built a memorial in Sohachev many years later for all the Jews of the town. There's a picture in the book of this memorial, which a few years ago was vandalized and a graffiti written on it with a spelling error. And the graffiti says, "The Holocaust never happened," smiley face. So I'm happy to take questions if anybody wants to ask me.
You can type a question in the chat box. If you'd like to unmute yourselves, you can do that as well. We are taking questions. Don't be shy.
Ella, hi. Why do you think there are so many fewer stories about the labor camps than there are about the extermination camps? It's like, you know, I think, you know, Schindler's List aside, this was something that was really a surprise to me. And it shouldn't have been, but, or maybe it's just me that I didn't know.
It's not just you, Judith. It's a good question. Because for many reasons. First of all, these camps were small in comparison. They held 1,000, 2,000 people, maybe 3,000 people, and the Germans made the Jews destroy them as they were moved from camp to camp. So as the war was progressing and they were moving from one camp to the other, and the Germans realizing this war will end, they would bomb or burn these camps many times with Jews, living people inside. They would burn them alive, so there would be no evidence of these camps. When I wrote the book, and the book went to the editor, this editor, who was specialized in Holocaust literature, had never heard of these camps, but there were thousands of them, and not only by Hasag. There were camps, as I said, by GM, by Ford, by many other companies who collaborated with the Nazis. And so I think that it's easier for people to latch on to one large camp with a crematorium, and people were tattooed, and so there's something more tangible about it than the idea that people were forced to work in small camps which were in fact death camps, but which were gradually destroyed as Germany started losing the war. I think this is the main reason why many people don't know about them, because there is no evidence, unless there were survivors who told it. But in many, there were zero survivors.
There is a question in the chat box. What do you think of the recent prevalence of white supremacy in the USA, and what do you think can be done about it? Another part to that question, and what is the role of corporations in this today? It seems you discuss this a lot in your book in the context of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Great questions. You know, we have to do another different Zoom for what's been going on in this country. I think there is so much ignorance in the United States, not only in the United States, but particularly here, about what this white supremacy movement is and how it manifests itself. I'm careful not to get into the politics of it, but I will tell you that part of the reason the Holocaust happened, as you know, is because people did nothing, because people stayed indifferent, and people did not help one another. and millions supported this. They became the enablers. And so we need to be really careful about where this country is going. And we need to choose our leadership very carefully, and we need to choose our representatives really carefully and watch what they're doing. And we cannot stay silent. You will not, I mean, you won't believe what I heard from different people, even around the area where we live, about this guy who wore the Auschwitz sweatshirt, or the 6 million were not enough shirts. I heard crazy things said about it, including that they were planted there by the left. But I think we need to educate young people. We need to go into school. We need to talk about this, and we need to make it tangible. It's very difficult to understand what 6 million people mean, or 1.5 million children were murdered. It's very intangible. So we need to find ways to make it real, to make people speak from their heart, to take children to, you know, my father always said, you know, it's very easy to commit genocide and then open museums. He was very resentful, you know, for all these museums. But I think education is at the root of it. And I think we need to stop being silent, and we need to talk, and we need to tackle these people who think it's okay to be a white supremacist. I even know Jews who believe, you know, these capital people were just fine people. So indifference is not the solution, and pretending things are not happening. That's a great question, and the answer is very complicated. But if we did some for example, they were set in camps and was rotting, thinking, you know, people cared. And at the same time, nobody lost a night's sleep in America over this. You know, the American administration knew exactly what was going on, and nothing was done about it, while people like my father were being assassinated and tortured and starved to death, and while mothers and children were being murdered every single day. So I think that we need to elevate the way we function in the corporate world. I was, I have a perspective. I spent the last few years as an internal consultant to the Vatican, and I became the person. First of all, they knew I was Jewish, of course, when they hired me, and they also knew I was Israeli, American Israeli, and for me, I was very ambivalent, because every single day when I walked there, I remember the role the Vatican played during the Holocaust. And to this day, they're holding Jewish assets, artwork and other things. And I was astounded to realize how many people inside the Roman Church, priests and clergy, were never educated about the role of the Vatican during the war. I was shocked. I would sit with them and talk about it anytime I could. And by the way, I met many priests who ended up being completely Jewish, whose parents hid their past because they were afraid of a new Holocaust. But that's another Zoom call. But I think we need to find some guidelines. I think CEOs of companies need to sit down together and try to elevate the way they do business, how they do business, and look more on the human side, you know, and interact with companies where there is no hate, or with countries where at least some efforts are done to operate in you know, in it's, I don't want to walk into a minefield here, but let's say morally, and not with companies that employ children, for example, or that employ forced labor. I mean, there are countries, I think in Africa today, that force children for a little bowl of rice. Children have to go inside holes in the earth to get some mineral that we use in our cell phones. And if they don't provide that material, they don't eat that day. So I think there are ways to resolve it, but I think we need to look at it on a macro level, and we as consumers need to expect this kind of leadership from CEOs of the largest firms. You know, maybe we can form some forums about it, and you know, develop such, you know, guidelines. Anyway, I can talk about it much more, but we can move to another question.
There's a few more questions. How do you think it affects your children, third generation survivors?
Great question, difficult. The answers are very complicated. I have two children who were born in New York and grew up in Westchester, and who experienced anti-Semitism in Westchester. So I was the recipient of as I said, of the Holocaust without filters. When my children were born, I started asking myself, what do I tell them? What don't I tell them? And then, you know, the best way was just to be myself and to be authentic, and not pretend things didn't happen, and try to keep things age appropriate. And at the same time, it's a very fine line to walk. I think it's very important our children know what happened, because this is the last generation of the very few people who are alive. My mother, who is also a Holocaust survivor, who actually, contrary to my father, barely talked about it. She's 90 years old. She's the last generation that the children can hear their stories. After that, we have to be the voice of this history. They were Jewish. That's it. Or because they were gypsies, or because they were gay, or because they had some handicap, or because the Hitler followers, you know, I don't know, they didn't have blue eyes. But I think we need to have a social responsibility to make it very real to the third generation. And we need to take this responsibility, because there will be no one here to do it. And if our children don't know where they came from, or where they might go, these guys from the Capitol, you know, next time they will take over if no one does anything about it. And third and fourth and fifth generation won't know better. What will stop them? So I think it's very important. And we do not protect our children by not sharing these stories. I think we make them stronger by telling them about it, and by facing it in an authentic, real way. That's my opinion.
Another question, this is from Darby. Was there any accountability for any of the US companies?
No. No. Zero. If you recall, last year, I think it was, a company that's very, it's a big company that has lots of franchises in the United States. I think Pret-à-Manger is one of them. I don't recall exactly, so don't quote me on that. The grandchildren of the owners, who were Germans and Nazis, pretended to realize that their parents or grandparents had labor camps and decided to donate, I don't know, $1 billion to survivors of labor camps that employed Jewish labor force for their parents or grandparents' companies. But it came of their own volition, and I don't know why they decided 1 billion and not 60 billion. I think it was more to, I don't know. But the answer to the question as to the US companies that were in bed with the Nazis and where the Nazis used Jewish labor force, there was no accountability. Not to US companies, to any of them.
There was somebody who had their hand up. Helene, I don't know if you had a question. I didn't see it in the chat. If you'd like to ask it.
Sure, I did write it. Hi, Ella. It's
Hi.
Helene.
Oh, hi.
Hey, you talked about your father and obviously all that he went through, and obviously it broke him terribly, but he was able to sort of create a life for himself. He got married, had children, had a successful career. So my question for you is, was he able to find joy in the life that he created? And was he able to sort of, enjoy life finally, given the fact that, he did create this wonderful scenario for himself after the terrible life he lived?
So that's a great question. I like this question because it's a question I often asked him too. When I grew up and when I was very little, I never cried, ever. Because I remember maybe I was 3 and I cried one day, and my father said, "I do not like to see children cry." So I never cried again. And then as I grew up, I understood what he meant, because he never saw a child, except that one child that the Germans turned into a murderer. My father could never sing. He felt guilty about feeling joy. He felt guilty about feeling happiness. I do know I was very close to him, and I do know we had moments of happiness, but it was like a bottomless pit. Nothing ever filled the sense of loss, the sense of guilt of why he survived, the unknown about what happened to his siblings, his family, his friends. So my father did not feel he survived, Helene. I saw him happy. I saw him happy on occasion, and I did see joy, but it was like almost like something pulled him back immediately from that space. He was very successful financially, extremely successful, and a big part of him was inconsolable because the loss was so deep. So life was more about the loss. He spoke about the Holocaust constantly, all the time, mostly to me. So were there moments of joy? Yes. Were there moments of happiness? Yes. But he deserved more joy and more happiness. That didn't happen for him.
Thank you.
There are no other questions in the chat, but I had a question for you. In writing this book and writing his memoirs, did this help your father maybe not to heal? Because how do you heal from something like this? But was it a way for him to release some of the guilt that he felt, to share that story, to make sure the generations to come will have a source, will have a reference, his word, his evidence, so to speak?
So my father did not know the book was published. He did not know it was published on the day Mauthausen was liberated, with him being a skeleton there. Writing and working on the book did not alleviate his pain. Yeah, initially I thought it would help him. I thought that it would kind of free him a little bit, but it didn't. He was very frustrated that people didn't understand him. He was very, very lonely. After the war, he moved to Israel, and in Israel, he felt very stigmatized and misunderstood because Ben-Gurion wanted a new type of Israeli persona, which was strong and powerful and confident. And when he arrived to Israel, he was 26 and he weighed 60 pounds. And he had no one on this earth. And he felt abandoned. He felt abandoned by Israel. He felt abandoned by certain Jewish leaders. He felt abandoned by the world in general, that they were waiting for years and years and years to be saved by someone, and nothing happened. And so unfortunately, the book did not give him any sense of relief, but it's something he wanted. It was his dream. It was his revenge, was for people to know what happened to him and to his friends and to his family, and to believe it. That's what he wanted. So I made it happen. And hopefully it's just a tiny, tiny dent, but maybe it will have some ripple effect.
They do say the pen is mightier than the sword.
Question here.
There is a question. How do you respond to someone who doesn't know anything about the Holocaust? What is the best way to approach or help others learn about it all?
Wow. The question scares me because I hope everyone knows about the Holocaust. But if you meet somebody who never heard it, give them a book. If it's a child, give them Anne Frank's book. If it's a teenager, take them to the museum in Washington. Take them, if you're in Israel, to Yad Vashem. Introduce them to someone who is still alive so they can tell them. Sit down and talk to them. Offer them some books. They can also go to the Spielberg Foundation to see the videos. My father recorded 9 hours for the Spielberg Foundation, and during the interviews, he kept telling me they don't even know what questions to ask. They're so ignorant. And if they don't ask the right questions, they don't elicit the right answers or the memory. But watching these videos makes it personal because you have a human being sitting there and telling about what happened to them. So this is, our world has become very visual. Maybe something like this can be helpful. So depending on the age of the person and the context where you meet them, You can give them a book, take them to Washington Museum where you get somebody's identity, show them the videos, invite them to watch these videos. There are many resources, and never stop talking about it. And also telling people how important it is not to stand on the side and not to get involved. It's not okay. You have to speak up and you have to take a stand. Because if you don't take a stand, you help the one who is more powerful.
Very good questions. We have time for one or two more questions if anyone would like to either type it or you can unmute and share it.
Hi,
Hi,
I live in, excuse me. Thank you for giving me a wonderful story. I'm so impressed with your story. So sorry, my English is still not good. So sorry, but I would like to say your story is the most important thing for all over the people all over the country. My country, in Japan, politicians and people became stupid because 76 years has been continuing peace in my country. So people became stupid, foolish. We have to learn more about history. Yeah, I think your story is so fascinating, so impressive. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My book is actually sold in Japan. Amazon sells it.
I will try to read it. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for attending.
And this reminds me that I should have mentioned at the beginning that the Village Bookstore of Pleasantville also is selling signed copies of Ella Scheinwald's book for anyone who'd like to purchase a copy, or if you'd like to borrow it from the library, it's also available at the library. But Ella was kind enough to sign copies, book plates, and get them to the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville. Amazon is good, but we can support local, that's also good. Another question from Galina. How much do your kids involve? Sorry, I've lost it. How much do your kids involve in, or how much are your kids involved in educating youth about the Holocaust?
My own children? Is that the question?
I believe.
Yes.
It's a question to ask them, but as far as I know, they are very vocal about their own history, their grandparents' history. I am sure that where they met some questions about the Holocaust or hate, I have no doubt that they stand up and talk about this. Where you know, when they were students, my children are older now, but when they were students at NYU, I am sure that they had the opportunity to discuss the Holocaust and to talk about this, to perhaps even talk about their own experience with anti-Semitism in this country. And so I am 100% sure that my children will be completely capable of discussing this subject and educating other people if necessary on the topic. Yeah, you know, this question reminds me of an incident. I was maybe 11 or 12. I was in Paris. I was in school, and there was a teacher. I liked her very much. And one day, one of the students right in front of the teacher turned to me and said, "Did you steal my pen?" And I said, "No, I didn't touch your pen." And she said, "You're just a dirty Jew." And I remember the teacher who I liked so much smiled and said nothing. I remember my heart broke. She just smiled there. She was a beautiful lady, and she said nothing. And he taught me that you have to speak, and he taught me that you cannot expect other people to do anything for you. We have to speak. We have to say things. We have to be vigilant. We have to pick up leadership and keep this leadership accountable. We need to make sure that we have some principles of morals and ethics. And we need to be careful when we say certain things. You know, and I want to circle back to the idea, the fake idea that Jews went to the gas chambers like cattle. Jews did not go anywhere like cattle. It's the murderers and the millions and millions, the populations in Europe who were just, you know, becoming mass murderers. That's what they wanted, and that's what they did. So we need to speak about that, and we need to change that narrative. It's very, very important, because otherwise the lie gets perpetuated over generations. So I hope that people will find the courage and the inner strength to do it, because the generation of the very few Holocaust survivors who are still alive is not going to be with us much longer. We have to be their voices.
Thank you so much, Ella, for sharing your story, and to everyone for joining us tonight. We were saying how this is a difficult topic, especially now with the pandemic, but it needs to be addressed. And I think I admire you for your courage and for spreading the word. And I think
so
that's
much
how we can get the message out.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
It was our pleasure. On behalf of the Harrison Public Library, I thank you for also approaching us to do this program.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So that concludes tonight's presentation. And as Rabbi Hammerman needed to go, but it worked out beautifully in an ironic way that we were able to schedule this today for National Holocaust Remembrance Day. And it was meant to be like this. I really feel that, for everything to converge for us to be able to provide this program today of all days. So.
But I also think that it's very important that Rabbi left us to meet with teenagers. And the reason that I ask how much your kids involved in talking and educating youth about Holocaust, and how it's important for all of us to pass it to the next generation and educate them. Every year, Jewish Community Center has an exhibit, or used to have, it didn't happen this year. Had an exhibit about Holocaust. And I know that high school students were leading tours there. And it was very impressive to hear them talking about Holocaust experience that they only know through stories that told in their families and from books. So thank you so much. It's a very important topic, and it's very important to talk about it. And it's resonate in the President's statement today about Holocaust Remembrance Day, that he was saying that how it's important that the government, the leadership, takes the right approach and take steps and remember and not allow hate to drive our decisions and divide our country. Thank you so much.
Thank you.